What can each Resident Evil game actually teach us about how the next title should be made? What lessons does the massive success of Resident Evil 2 really offer for whatever comes next? Should Capcom stick with the classic survival horror vibe, or take the risk of going all in on a more modern approach? Which elements from the previous games are worth keeping around, and what should have been left in the dust years ago? The ingredient that separates a legendary Resident Evil from a total disaster is hidden in a detail so subtle that even longtime fans usually miss it, and that's exactly what we're about to uncover here. Resident Evil. The first Resident Evil makes it crystal clear atmosphere is everything. The Spencer Mansion, with its dark corridors, creaking doors, and that uncomfortable silence, pretty much becomes a character of its own inside the game. Nailing the right mood is the foundation of every respectable Resident Evil, and when the atmosphere hits the mark, everything else tends to fall into place naturally. The secret is in the balance. Keep the story simple and straightforward, never more complicated than it needs to be, and never getting in the way of the gameplay. No endless dialogue, no over-the-top plot twists that only serve to complicate the basics. Here, the mystery is built with just a handful of elements. The suspense comes from what isn't explained, from that constant sense of vulnerability that never really goes away. Another big win for the original Resident Evil is how it handles its monsters. Each creature gets its moment to shine, from the classic zombies and the Cerberus dogs to the hunters, who show up at just the right time to shake up the game's pace. The main villain, Wesker, is handled perfectly. Straightforward and understated, never cartoonish, but always carrying that air of constant threat. And when the final boss, the Tyrant, steps in, the game proves you don't need cheap theatrics to make a lasting impact. A direct entrance, an iconic look, and the sheer weight of the encounter make him a final boss to remember. It's proof that you don't have to go overboard to leave a mark. Other games in the series have managed to keep this high standard even when trying out new ideas, and Resident Evil 9 shouldn't be any different. Classic elements like backtracking, scarce resources, fixed camera angles, and tank controls were iconic for their time, but they don't have to come back just for nostalgia's sake. They only work if they have a purpose and are well executed, not just as throwbacks. What really matters is how these tools are used to crank up the sense of oppression and tension. If Resident Evil 9 wants to honor the legacy, it needs to understand that atmosphere isn't just about cutting-edge graphics, but about careful art direction, clever sound design, and a story that never overshadows the player's experience. The focus should be on creating an environment where the player always feels watched and threatened, without wasting time on unnecessary excess. If the new game can capture this essence, it'll already be halfway there to being remembered as a true Resident Evil. Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 is proof that smoothly alternating action, suspense, and exploration keeps players engaged from start to finish. For Resident Evil 9, that means investing in a dynamic rhythm where danger never feels far away and player curiosity is always rewarded. The creativity behind RE2's environments is another lesson worth noting. Even when the settings get a bit more open, that constant sense of threat and oppression should never go away, whether you're in the police station or any new area. The key is interconnected maps and spaces that slowly reveal themselves, avoiding that dreaded empty world feeling. The dual campaign structure, with different characters experiencing the same story from distinct perspectives, is another idea that could be reimagined for the new game. There's no need to copy the formula exactly, but exploring alternative paths or using multiple protagonists can make the experience more engaging and help create a less linear narrative, as long as everything has purpose and cohesion. Another essential lesson from RE2, and RE1 for that matter, is building memorable characters. In Resident Evil 9, the priority should be getting more out of the franchise's classic characters without trying to reinvent them, turn them into something they're not, or adding unnecessary complexity. The trick is to make good use of those who are already part of this universe, tapping into their charisma and the weight of their backstory. New additions are welcome and sometimes necessary, as long as they make sense within the narrative and are properly developed, steering clear of characters who are just there to fill space or follow whatever's trendy at the moment. Finally, RE2's replayability is something the next game should absolutely take to heart. Resident Evil 9 can and should give players real incentives to come back, whether through alternative campaign modes, challenge variations, performance rewards, or simply by delivering such interesting level design that you actually want to revisit it. The secret is making players want to return, without resorting to artificial tricks or mindless busy work. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. What truly sets Resident Evil 3 apart is having an iconic villain like Nemesis, a character capable of carrying the entire game on his back. For Resident Evil 9, the lesson is straightforward. A memorable antagonist can define the whole tone of the game, making every encounter stick in your memory and raising the experience as a whole. It's not just about designing a tough monster, but about building a presence that's instantly recognizable, with its own motivations and a real impact on the story. On top of that, RE3's extra modes show the value of offering high-quality bonus content that keeps players interested even after the main campaign wraps up. Resident Evil 9 would do well to include well-crafted side modes, challenges, or unlockable content that genuinely add value rather than just padding things out. The choice system in RE3 also added another layer to the experience, even if it was only used occasionally. For the new game, giving players small decisions with visible consequences might be all it takes to boost engagement without messing with the classic structure. Finally, the more dynamic action in RE3 proved it's possible to speed up the gameplay without losing the core spirit of the series. Resident Evil 9 should look for that same balance, serving up intense, unpredictable moments, but always grounded in an atmosphere of constant tension and threat. And Jill Valentine, seriously, we need more of her. Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica proves you can be bold with storytelling without having to rewrite the lore from scratch. Resident Evil 9 can, and should, dive deep into the rich history the franchise has already built, making the most of the existing connections and elements to tell a strong story without falling into the trap of expanding the universe just for the sake of it. The moments when Code Veronica tries to go overboard, piling on plot twists and handing out ridiculous powers to its characters, are exactly where it loses the player's engagement. The takeaway for the next game is to aim for narrative cohesion and only embrace complexity when it genuinely serves to strengthen the player's connection to the characters and villains. Taking the time to properly develop the antagonist's motivations is always worth it, because it adds real impact and gives more weight to everything that happens. The key is to avoid turning characters into caricatures, or giving them over-the-top powers, like what happened with Matrix Mode Wesker. Resident Evil 9 can absolutely take narrative risks, but it should focus on what already works, and deliver an engaging experience without resorting to extremes that pull the player out of the immersion. Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil 0 reinforces what's already been said. Expanding the lore can work, but there's a point where too much complexity starts to get in the way of the experience. For Resident Evil 9, the advice is straightforward. Make the most of the universe that's already been built, but avoid piling on unnecessary layers that only complicate the narrative and pull attention away from the suspense. Characters with shades of gray, who leave players genuinely unsure about their true motives, are a great way to build tension, and definitely worth exploring. On the other hand, ideas like mind-controlling creatures end up coming across as cringeworthy. Ultimately, the secret is keeping the suspense and uncertainty alive, without going overboard or resorting to wild plot devices that actually weaken the story. Resident Evil Remake. If the original proved that a simple story can be highly effective, the remake showed that well-thought-out additions not only work, but actually fix old problems and close important narrative gaps. For Resident Evil 9, the lesson is clear. You can absolutely enhance established elements by introducing new ideas that respect the source material, but still manage to bring something fresh to the experience. Everything that worked in the first game still matters, but it can and should be adapted to fit modern mechanics and standards. The remake already demonstrated that rethinking details and deepening the atmosphere doesn't compromise the core, as long as it's done carefully. Resident Evil 9 should take the same approach, refining what already exists, fixing what needs attention, and adding innovations that truly enhance the experience, all without ever losing sight of the series' classic identity. Resident Evil 4. Rethinking core concepts isn't a crime, as long as there's courage and purpose behind the decision. Resident Evil 4 is proof that you can let go of supposedly untouchable elements, classic zombies, pure suspense, branching paths, fixed cameras, and traditional puzzles, and still come out on top, as long as there's a clear vision guiding those changes. shifting to a more dynamic style of gameplay with greater freedom of movement, injected new life into the series without sacrificing its essence, and of course the horror is still there. Of course all those other elements are still present, at least in a symbolic way. Of course Leon is still there. Keeping certain features that tie the game back to the series' identity matters, but being willing to experiment with new gameplay ideas is crucial to keep things from getting stale. For Resident Evil 9, the best advice is to strike a balance between tradition and innovation. The real trick is making sure these changes are well-founded and actually add to the experience, not just thrown in for shock value or temporary hype. Resident Evil 4 proved that taking risks is part of the series' evolution, and if done thoughtfully, can produce an instant classic. And honestly, a merchant character in Resident Evil 9 doesn't sound like a bad idea at all. That suggestion alone is worth a like. Resident Evil 5 delivers some valuable lessons on what to avoid and what can be used if handled with care. The co-op mode, when well executed, can be a solid addition for Resident Evil 9, but there's no need for it to dominate the entire game. A more focused approach with specific campaigns or optional co-op modes could add variety without sacrificing the tension that defines the series. Who knows? Maybe we finally get to see Leon and Chris teaming up for certain missions. On the flip side, the excessive focus on action ended up diluting the horror atmosphere that's always set Resident Evil apart. Resident Evil 9 needs to find the right balance, making sure gunfights and explosive set pieces never overshadow the sense of dread and suspense. The story in Resident Evil 5 is also a cautionary tale. It's so complicated that it actually drags the game down, and so uninteresting that I honestly couldn't care less about what's happening. The next game needs to steer clear of plots that just get in the way, and instead focus on narratives that truly engage, without trying too hard to be clever or losing sight of what actually matters to the player experience. And absolutely no superpowers, whether it's Matrix-style antics or super punches and boulders. Resident Evil 6. Honestly, I have the unpopular opinion that the idea of different campaigns, each with its own focus and unique gameplay, could have worked. Emphasis on could. But what do I know, right? I'm just a beginner YouTuber. By the way, if you want to help me grow and see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Back to the game. The real issue wasn't the concept itself, but the lack of real effort and attention to make it actually work. Another misstep was trying to chase every gaming trend at the time with no clear purpose or any strong reason to tie it all together. Someday I'll go deeper into how this system could have been done right. But for now, let's get straight to the point. It's important to recognize what shouldn't be done. Resident Evil 6 is a case of excess. There's too much going on, too much information thrown at the player, and ironically, very little originality. Leon kills the president, Chris turns into an alcoholic, Wesker has a son. None of these twists land because they're tossed in at random, as if hoping something sticks. Seriously, cut out that kind of gratuitous layer, focus on a cohesive story, and then you can think about bringing in more characters, as long as there's a real reason for them to be there. Another problem that sank the game: enemies with zero identity. Generic monsters, copy-pasted designs, everything so over the top it felt like they were just churning out creatures on autopilot. What's missing is the care to create monsters that actually leave a mark. Ones that are scary not just because of how they look, but because of the context, their role in the story, and even the way they behave in different environments. If the early games set the standard for well-crafted monsters and villains, this is the complete opposite. The lesson here is obvious: put real effort into this part. Distinct campaigns could absolutely work, but to avoid making the same mistake, Resident Evil 9 needs to define a clear identity and stick to it, instead of becoming a hostage to passing trends or trying to please everyone at once. The Resident Evil 7. You can never have too much horror in this franchise. Resident Evil 7 proved that going all in on terror can give the series a whole new lease on life. The first-person perspective can work, though it's not my personal favorite, if it's used with purpose, pushing discomfort and immersion to the next level. The technical side of things deserves real praise here. It's not just about realistic graphics, it's about crafting environments and soundscapes that genuinely make you uneasy, where every detail works in favor of the atmosphere. Bringing in a new protagonist comes with two very different lessons. On one hand, it's totally possible to build strong stories outside the franchise's traditional core. On the other, your main character needs to be at least somewhat interesting, which, let's be honest, was definitely not the case with Ethan. For Resident Evil 9, it's worth taking risks on new protagonists and new stories, but only if you're willing to give us someone with real personality and presence, someone players can actually care about. Resident Evil 2 Remake. This is a masterclass in how to adapt classic franchise elements to a modern, dynamic style of gameplay. The balance between nostalgia and innovation here is about as close to perfect as it gets. Updating the pacing, tweaking the design, and reimagining the environments didn't just breathe new life into the game, it managed to attract new players without alienating longtime fans. If Resident Evil 9 wants to take inspiration from past titles, it needs to find this exact sweet spot between tradition and reinvention. Don't be afraid to update what needs to be updated, but always respect the DNA of the series. And of course, everything that applies to the original Resident Evil 2 still holds true here. Resident Evil 3 Remake. If the RE2 Remake was a showcase of how to pull off a respectful and competent update, RE3 did the exact opposite. Here, everything comes down to a lack of care and direction. Cutting content, simplifying the threat of Nemesis, and some questionable adaptation choices showed the risks of overhauling the original foundation to the point where you strip away what gave the game its identity in the first place. To make matters worse, the buggy and inconsistent gameplay failed to please even newcomers to the franchise. Resident Evil 9 needs to steer clear of decisions that water down the challenge just to make things easier for the player. The focus has to be on creating truly memorable experiences with robust content and well-crafted gameplay, never resorting to shortcuts that dilute what has made the series stand out from the very beginning. The Resident Evil Village. This might be a bit of a hot take, but the over-the-top mysticism really took away from the experience for me. The gravitational center of Resident Evil has always been biological horror, and in my opinion, when you start blending in too many supernatural elements, the game loses part of its identity. Sure, Resident Evil Village was well received, and that shows this approach can work for Resident Evil 9, it just wouldn't be my personal choice. The variety of environments does give the gameplay some breathing room, but pushing that variety too far can turn the game into a kind of unfocused theme park where everything happens at once and nothing truly stands out. Resident Evil 9 needs to learn from this and focus more on thematic cohesion, resisting the urge to mash everything together just to impress. And it's not that Village has nothing positive to offer, just that most of the real lessons have already shown up in earlier games, and I'm not going to repeat myself here and risk boring you. Resident Evil 4 Remake. Everything that Resident Evil 4, along with the remakes of 1 and 2, brought to the franchise in a positive way, applies here as well. Respect for the original material, smart updates, and tight gameplay are all great directions for the 9th game. The only thing that really doesn't need to be repeated is turning Leon into a full-on ninja. So, that's it. These were my thoughts on what each game could bring to the next release. But if I had to single out the one element that really stands out in all of the franchise's best moments, it's a consistent sense of identity, staying true, both to the essence of the series and to what each individual game sets out to be. Resident Evil is at its best when it knows exactly what path it wants to take, instead of trying to do everything at once or chase whatever's trendy at the moment. Now I want to hear from you. What's something the next Resident Evil absolutely can't do without? What's the one element that's essential for the game to be worthy of the franchise? Drop your thoughts in the comments and I'll catch you next time.